I ported the movement, captures, and collectibles from Super Mario Odyssey to Portal 2. So instead of picking up cubes, you can capture them to move around as if you were the cube. And instead of walking around, you've got Mario's entire movement arsenal. All interactions with the world happen through Cappy. This means that the functionality of the use key is completely replaced with throwing the hat. With this, you can still do just about everything you could normally, and sometimes even more. Miscellaneous physics props fall back to what essentially works like a game of Gmod prop hunt. You can roll around as the prop and even get into tight spaces that the player normally could not, which is gonna come in handy later when we get to the moons. Of course, some specific props have unique behavior when captured. Capturing Wheatley while he's attached to a rail, for example, will put you in his point of view. But to prevent soft locks, throwing Cappy at a core when it's on the ground will just pick it up instead. There are, of course, limitations to what you can capture. Typically, anything smaller than the player is fine. GLaDOS doesn't fit this category, so don't get your hopes up. Anyway, enough about the captures, let's talk movement. By the way, if in some of these clips you see a gray beanie instead of, well, Cappy, that's because I was using placeholder models earlier in development, and who knows, if Nintendo decides to sue me for making a silly mod, I might have to switch back to this. Hopefully not, but we'll see. Immediately after long jumps and cap dives were implemented, one thing was apparent. This mod is incredibly satisfying for at least Portals runs. In fact, the first thing I did with this is attempt a full game run with as few portal placements as possible. I didn't even need to pick up the portal gun in the incinerator. And because of how ridiculous this movement is, some levels let you just jump straight to the end. Now, of course, sometimes the prop hunt-esque capture mechanics lead to some incredibly wacky solutions. Like here, to get the cube out of this cage without using portals, I just stack a few of these rocks on top of each other to ramp the cube out. Now, you might think that this is so that I could, you know, put the cube on the button. But without a way to pick up the cube or a pair of portals, it's almost impossible to get it up to the exit. This is where a really cool technical exploit comes in. The doors in the Portal 2 single-player campaign maps will not close if there's a player in the way. Speedrunners often use this for tricks like the laser switch glitch, but here, you can open the door by just standing on the button and then capturing an object that's close to it. This makes the game think that there's a player blocking the door, and this is just a small example of what's possible with this tech. But, okay. Maybe you're not so into the speedrunning side of things. And that's okay, because there's a whole campaign of moons scattered through various places in Aperture. As per the nature of Mario Odyssey, some of these are out in plain sight. These are what you'd call story moons. They are the bare minimum required for progression. Others, however, will require either much more careful observation or full mastery of the movement tech. At the end of each chapter, you're given a recount of the moons you've collected, as well as an option to go back if you've missed any. Each of these Odysseys sets a minimum moon requirement that you have to match in order to proceed to the next chapter. Again, you can find pretty much all the moons you need by just playing through the campaign casually, but a good amount of thought has been put into the more challenging ones. They're positioned out of sight in hard-to-reach places, usually high above the intended play area, to make use of the verticality that this movement allows for. And just like in the original, you can't collect moons with Cappy, but you can, however, capture other props to help you get to places you normally couldn't. Now, obviously, the moon placements are not as varied as they would be in Odyssey. After all, Portal 2 consists of tiny, individual boxed-in chambers as opposed to an open world designed for placing collectibles. It is still fun to try and seek them out, don't get me wrong, but I think I'll focus more on the other tech from now on. And to avoid any more spoilers, I'm actually disabling all the moons throughout the rest of the video. And I guess that means we're back to the least Portals run, which in my opinion is the highlight of this mod. After all, when you think of Super Mario Odyssey, the first thing that comes to mind is typically Cappy and the unique capture mechanics he provides, as well as the typically bouncy and versatile movement of the Mario genre as a whole. This is the kind of stuff that's at its best when it's pushed to its limits, and what better way to do that than to avoid the main selling point of Portal 2 and just focus on the new stuff. That said, most maps in Chapter 2 focus on lasers, which we can't really redirect with Cappy alone. Of course, you can still capture a laser cube, that works just about as you'd expect, but there's no way to get around placing portals for any lasers that are above ground. But this chapter is also where Faith Plates get introduced. And this lets me show you something that I think is really cool. When capturing a flying physics prop, you can give it unlimited acceleration. There's no friction like there would be on ground, and Cappy accelerates the object at a constant speed, which basically means that you've got full control over aerial movement. This will of course become very useful in maps like Ricochet, where a viable solution is literally just flying to the end. And the map after that is Bridge Intro, which should mean that it introduces us to light bridges, right? But ironically, the least portal strategy here doesn't use the bridge even once. Again, because of how much movement freedom you have in the air, I could just whip the cube out of the dropper and go straight to the button with only 2 portals. And then, after seeing how well that worked, I tried the same thing on the next map. But while I do think it's technically possible here, I ended up settling for 2 portals in favor of maintaining my sanity. Turret Intro is possible in 0 portals by default, so it's no surprise that this wasn't any different. The turrets themselves do have a unique capture mechanic, however. You enter a first-person perspective where you get to control the turret's gun, but much like a cool party trick, this isn't particularly useful. What does help is being able to move around as an indestructible metal box. The turrets still fire at Cappy, but you can't really sustain any damage while in this form. The next few maps aren't very difficult to perform in 0 portals, even on an unmodified game, so let's jump over to Column Blocker. We start off by running straight to the turret and capturing it, then jumping out and towards the button. This is pretty much the fastest and easiest way to clear this first part of the level. Oh, and by now, you've probably noticed that I use long jumps a lot, when in the original game, rolling would typically be more efficient. Well, keep in mind that this mod overlays the movement from Mario Odyssey, keeping the source engine movement as a base. So anything that moves through the air is typically going to be way faster, especially if combined with strafing. Anyway, back to Column Blocker. Once we get to the button, we still have to somehow safely get the cubes. Normally, you would do this with the light bridge, but to save a couple of portals, I captured one of the cubes to redirect the other one with it. And on laser chaining, I once again tried to exploit the insane air acceleration of the cubes by strafing out from this Faith Plate. But the ceiling turned out to be too low. Still, even at 2 portals, this solution is ridiculously fun. Triple Laser. At this point, pretty much everyone and their mother knows about this map. And a good portion of those people probably also know about the associated laser switch glitch. Typically, this is what makes the level easy, even in 0 portals. But that requires aiming the cube and pushing your back against the door. The best I can do here is one of those at a time. So my solution was to exploit another glitch that lets me activate the first receptor while keeping the laser. And from here, I could line up the second cube so that all I'd have to do is just jump into it to activate the door. After this, we've got the first map of the escape sequence. First, of course, we've got to go through the chamber, which requires pressing this button high up on the wall. This is where I get to introduce you to another fairly common mechanic exclusive to this port: corner wall jumps. In Super Mario Odyssey, there are a bunch of sections where you can chain wall jumps to get to high places. Portal 2, however, is a first-person game. Instead of rotating a floating camera, you rotate the playable character's head and body along with the camera. This allows for not only strictly linear back and forth wall jumps, but also ones that let you climb by jumping across a diagonal. And that's what I use here to get up to the pedestal button. After this, aside from some incredibly satisfying catwalk movement, the first part of the escape sequence is pretty normal. But things start to get fun when we get to Turret Factory. Right away, you're forced to use 2 portals here to get past the door. But even after that, there are a couple rooms that look like you could just jump right in them. But in reality, they're blocked off with invisible walls. This is ultimately what brings the minimum portal count up to 5 in an unmodified run. But I managed to bring it down to 3. First, I place one of the 2 initial portals next to Wheatley's rail. This will become much more important later on, but for now, this lets me comfortably skip a trigger that closes both the portals, which I will need for later. After that, I make my way over to the first of these invisible walls and place a portal somewhat close to the ground. This is the last portal I will place in this level, and because of that, I have to go all the way back to the start to enter it, which isn't really too difficult given the movement options. Here I'm also being careful to avoid any triggers that could close either of these portals. Once I'm back at the first room, I position myself on the edge of the portal and wait for Wheatley to come back to me. This is where the route really starts to unfold. Along the way, there are a bunch of triggers that tell Wheatley where I am, so that he can naturally follow me around with his flashlight. And the last portal I placed is right next to one of these triggers. If I peek through it, Wheatley will start running from the first room all the way to the other side of that little airlock. If I tap the trigger and immediately chase him down, I can just barely capture him and ride all the way to the end, even passing through a few of the solid walls on the way. This is something you can only pull off with mechanics as wacky as these. Anyway, the next few maps aren't really special in their own right, so let's talk Old Aperture, that is, the underground sections. Here, the obvious difference lies in the scale and openness of the area. Everything can be skipped. There are enough little nubs to climb on to the point where you can scale entire walls with relatively simple movement. Sure, some distances might be more impressive in terms of scale, but again, the nearly unlimited freedom this area presents does wonders to complement our newfound agility. Though I will say that due to the consistent theming of Cave's test chambers, some cliches start to pop up. Namely, these construction beams, or whatever they are, make it all too easy to climb right to the top with minimal effort. Which, again, following the cliches, is usually where the exit is. But at least in that sense, Crazy Box stood out a fair bit. There was no overly obvious construction beam, and even the ones that were present weren't any bit closer to the exit than the rest of the chamber, which means that it made more sense to just solve it normally, whatever that would end up meaning. And this led us to finding out about another cool trick that I hadn't experimented with before. Because I can chain however many wall jumps I want, having repulsion gel and a wall nearby meant that I could gain as much height as I need to get over said wall, and in this case, that's just what I needed to progress the chamber. When we arrived to the final room, I found out that you can capture the cube here through the glass, which I then proceeded to have a bit of fun with. Speaking of breaking conventions, the level Potatoes finally provided a jump that was too much to handle, even with this ludicrous range of horizontal movement. We tried this one for about a dozen minutes before settling for 2 portals. I mean, hey, it's not that bad. The rest of this was still portal-less. With just a bit of climbing and a cleverly routed jump at the end, we were out of Chapter 6 with only 25 portals total. At this point, in a theoretically perfect, unmodified least portals run, we would be at 42. Quite the reduction, and it could possibly go even lower with some more patience. Chapter 7 was once again way too open for its own good. And, okay, don't get me wrong, while it might sound like I'm speaking about this in a negative light, these chapters are arguably the most fun to play around in. It's much closer to the open world areas of Super Mario Odyssey. The last 2 maps of this chapter, that being Conversion Intro and 3 Gels, were definitely the biggest and yet toughest. But surprisingly, with just some clever parkour and relentless wall jumping towards the end, Conversion Intro required no additional portals. 3 Gels was almost entirely clean, except for the infamous Grate, which has hindered a lot of other cool challenges too. It also serves as the reason for why I don't think there will be a way to drop this map under 2 portals for a long time. Chapter 8 starts off as not so inviting, forcing us to fire 2 portals right off the bat. But as for the simplest chamber of the entire game, as some may call it, I mean, yeah. What'd you expect? Of course it's 0. Here, we also get introduced to the mechanics of the Franken turrets. Instead of tumbling around like any other prop, these guys hop at regular intervals, much like they would when left alone for a while. This wasn't really an issue here, but it will fundamentally change how some of the later levels work. Anyway, moving on to something typically more controversial, I actually didn't profusely exploit the funnel fly glitch here. I showed restraint. I know, crazy. Call it character development if you will. But okay, in all seriousness, not only would it be difficult to get the crouch fly glitch here, it would also completely overshadow the intricate movement. Not like it needed on this map anyways, just another tutorial. But moving on to something more complicated, we end up spending just over an hour on Ceiling Button trying to get it down to 2 portals, until I finally caved in and settled on 3. It's certainly not the proudest hour I've spent, but whatever, I'll live. If anything, the next map, Wall Button, was significantly sketchier. My entire route revolved around a glitch, which let me clip out of the dropper after I captured the cube. I even took a break from playing for the evening to come up with this one. Polarity is one of the more straightforward maps, requiring nothing more than just a few jumps and wall climbs, so let's talk about Funnel Catch instead. Getting to the button wasn't the hard part, that's just a couple of jumps, but this is where the Franken turret hopping I mentioned earlier comes into play. It felt like I had to land some kind of insane trick shot to get it up there. There was a similar case on Stop the Box, where to avoid placing portals, I had to hit a mad strafe with the cube to land on the catwalk. And the pain didn't really stop there, as I had to somehow get back after getting the cube on the button, which wasn't made easy when all the turrets were constantly primed and ready to open fire at any moment. So I decided to bait them out and jump into the cube to ram it onto the button instead. Next up, let's just pretend that laser catapult doesn't exist. I mean, honestly, you can skip it so easily that it's basically nothing more than an intermediary before the next map, which is laser platform. This one was a bit more tricky because I couldn't find a way to get the cube out of the dropper safely without using a couple of portals. So that's what we ended up doing. And then the last 2 maps of the chapter use a large gap between the chamber and the exit door as the primary obstacle. Needless to say, it's not much of an obstacle to our boy Cappy. But even this late into the game, I still managed to bring up a quirk of the movement mechanics that I hadn't mentioned before. As we already established, being a third-person game, Super Mario Odyssey forces your character to look in the direction that you're going in. One of the joysticks controls your camera, of course, while the other controls both movement and facing direction together, which doesn't allow for strafing. In Portal 2, however, you can move regardless of your aim. This was actually one of the tougher design hiccups when combining both games. You already saw part of it with the corner wall jumps, and in this specific case, you can use the strafing to build up the required speed for a long jump, even on incredibly thin ledges, as long as you're just looking forward. Now, I would love to say that this final puzzle piece climactically solved the test chamber, but nah. I just climbed on top of the playable area, which is still not out of bounds, technically, and I just navigated the rest from there. Anyway, entering the part where he kills you, we don't actually follow through with the cutscene. Instead, to save a couple of portals, you can just barely make it to one of these decorative catwalks higher up. And then the end of Finale 1 wasn't any more difficult either. In fact, pretty much all of the finale levels are comparable to low-gravity parkour tracks. Again, that's not in any way meant to be negative criticism. It's actually way more satisfying in terms of gameplay, but then the narrator has nothing to talk about. There was one forced pair of portals at the very start of Finale 3. This is where the game is trying to teach us how bombs interact with conversion gel tubes to prepare the player for the final boss fight. After that though, to get into the boss room, you have to portal past a solid grate. Luckily, we can exploit the crouch trigger glitch in combination with a backflip to activate the level transition early. And because the game expects me to have a pair of portals here already, it just opens a new pair. I never fired these portals, so they don't count towards the total. Then, in order to reach the top of the shaft, it really is as simple as just chaining a bunch of wall jumps. And keep in mind that I'm calling this simple. Not easy, okay? There's a difference. While it is just repeating the same flick and jump movement over and over, each individual jump is actually fairly precise. It took me about 10 minutes, so it's not the worst thing in the world, but, you know, be prepared if you plan to do this. Alright, games aside, this is the final boss fight. It's Chell with a potato and a goofy looking hat versus Wheatley. And it is time to answer the question that everyone's been waiting for. Can you capture the funny spinning potato? Yes. Okay, good. Moving on. Now for the less relevant question, the way I plan to defeat the British Metal Sphere is by capturing the bombs and steering them back at him. It's trickier than it looks, trust me, but it's the only way we can achieve this without using portals. And we can keep this going pretty much entirely dry up until the very end, where we are forced to fire a couple of portals into the stalemate room, and then another portal to end off the run. 43. that's the final tally. Though I understand that you're probably not highly interested in the Portal savings, again, there's a whole campaign of moons that wasn't shown throughout this video, so even if you're a casual player or a speedrunner, you'll find something to sink your time in. If you want to try this mod for yourself, you can subscribe to the channel as a thankful gesture and check the description. There, you'll find a link to the mod, as well as a link to this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with creative courses on pretty much anything you'd want to learn. If you've seen the last couple of videos on this channel, you'll know that I've been taking some courses in graphic design for, well, various reasons actually, one of them being thumbnails. Currently, I'm looking at a class from Martin Perhiniak titled Graphic Design Theory, Color and Contrast, which gives some more insight on, well, the theory behind colors. I always knew there was more to it than just, ooh, pretty color, and this course structures it in a very nicely paced manner, so that's my personal recommendation. If you want to try this out, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. And as I mentioned before, that's also where you'll find a download link to this mod, and, you know, the subscribe button. But do keep in mind that what you saw here is still only an early preview of sorts. Sure, I understand that it might look like a fairly polished and otherwise finished mod, and don't get me wrong, you are getting a quality experience regardless. But what I mean to say is that I'm going to be updating this regularly, until the result fully adheres to the initial vision. And I don't mean to sound overly poetic or sentimental here, like I'm not a huge fan of the Mario games myself. What I mean is, the goal here is to make a fun twist on the game that feels complete. If you're watching this a year from when it was uploaded, then that vision has probably already been accomplished. Go have some fun, and thanks for watching.